It was the kind of flight where the luxurious hum of the engine seemed to lull everyone into a false sense of ease. The faint smell of expensive perfume, the clink of champagne glasses, and the soft chatter of first-class passengers all blended together in a harmonious symphony of wealth and privilege. But for one man, this was the perfect opportunity to make himself feel superior. Jared was a seasoned traveler, the type who looked down on anyone who didn't share his first-class status. He had worked his way up, and to him, that was something to flaunt. So when he spotted a young woman sitting across from him in the plush seat, looking far less out of place than the other passengers, he couldn't resist. She was in her early 20s, with blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail, and she had a face that seemed too young for the kind of comfort this space promised. Jared leaned back in his seat, raised an eyebrow, and smirked. He had one of those faces that screamed, "I'm better than you," and he loved to put it to use. As the flight attendants passed by, he nudged one of them with his finger and casually nodded toward the woman sitting a few rows ahead. "Is she lost?" he asked, just loud enough for her to hear. "I mean, first class isn't really the place for someone like her, right?" The flight attendant froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The woman in question, Karoline Leavitt, didn't flinch. She simply glanced up, locking eyes with Jared, a small, polite smile on her lips. It was the kind of smile that, in a less crowded room, might have made anyone second-guess their next words. But Jared didn't notice. Instead, he made his move, leaning further forward. "I mean, who let her into this section?" he continued, louder this time, as if to prove his point to the entire cabin. "Did she win a contest or something?" Karoline's smile remained unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that Jared missed. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, Jared couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. His words had landed, and he was sure that everyone else was silently agreeing with him. The woman across from him, Karoline, wasn't exactly fitting in with the high-end passengers, and Jared relished the idea that he had exposed her for what she truly was, an outsider. But then, something strange happened. As the flight attendants continued their rounds, one of them approached Karoline's seat with a small envelope in hand. It wasn't anything special, just a plain white envelope, but the look on the attendant's face was different. It wasn't the usual polite, impersonal demeanor they all wore. There was a hint of reverence, like they were presenting something much more significant than a simple letter. Karoline took the envelope, her fingers brushing against the attendant's as she smiled and nodded. She opened it carefully, reading the contents for a moment before folding it neatly and placing it back in her bag. Jared couldn't help but be curious. Was this some sort of VIP service? Maybe she did have a special pass. His smirk faltered slightly, but his confidence remained. After all, it wasn't like he'd made any real mistake. She still didn't belong here. Or so he thought. It wasn't long before the flight attendants began passing out small boxes of gourmet chocolates, a final treat before they reached cruising altitude. Karoline, still smiling, took a box and placed it on her lap, her eyes glancing toward Jared as she opened it. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. Jared's arrogance, so carefully cultivated, slipped just a little more when he caught a glimpse of something, a name on a document she had pulled from her bag. It was a program schedule, one he recognized all too well. It wasn't just any program. It was a political gala, an event he had heard about for weeks, the same gala he had been trying to get into, the one that people in his circles had been buzzing about. And there, on the top of the page, was the name he had seen countless times in the media, Karoline Leavitt. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. The name hit him like a freight train, and everything clicked in an instant. The young woman sitting across from him wasn't just some random passenger, she was the political figure he had mocked. She was a rising star, a name making waves across the country. But before Jared could collect his thoughts, Karoline spoke up, her voice smooth and unwavering. "Actually, I'm Karoline Leavitt," she said casually, looking directly at him. "And I think you might owe me an apology." Jared's heart skipped a beat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The smug confidence that had been oozing from him just moments earlier was now replaced by a gnawing feeling of dread. Karoline's eyes were still locked onto his, her gaze piercing yet calm. There was no anger in her voice, no harshness, just a quiet assurance that made Jared feel small and foolish. The silence between them stretched, and he could feel the weight of every other passenger in first class noticing the shift. Their eyes were subtly drifting toward him, as if waiting for some kind of drama to unfold. And in a way, it was. His mind raced. Karoline Leavitt, he recognized the name now. She was a former press secretary, a political strategist with a growing influence in the Republican Party. She had made waves for her sharp critiques of current leaders and her outspoken views on the future of American politics. She had been in the news constantly, and yet, here she was, in front of him, with that same polite smile still on her lips. Jared tried to recover, his face turning a little red as he adjusted himself in his seat. He could hear the rustle of the other passengers, their curiosity palpable. Some were whispering, others pretending to be absorbed in their own business, but Jared could tell they were all watching the scene unfold. He cleared his throat, attempting to play it cool. "I didn't realize you were, someone important," he said, fumbling with his words. "I mean, I thought you were just, well, you don't look like someone who'd be sitting up here with us." He gestured vaguely, still trying to cling to some semblance of superiority. But Karoline didn't flinch. Her smile remained the same, polite, composed, but now there was something else in her expression. Amusement? Perhaps. "People tend to think that way," she said softly. "It's easy to assume things when you're too focused on appearances and not enough on substance." Her voice was smooth, calm, as though she was delivering a quiet lesson in humility. "But I guess that's how the world works, isn't it? People make judgments without bothering to ask questions first." Jared swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything to save face. He was used to being in control, used to people looking up to him. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt small. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't deny it, he had made a massive misstep. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just anyone, she was a powerful voice, someone whose opinions and actions shaped the political landscape. And here he was, a man who had made fun of her, mocked her, based solely on her appearance and his own assumptions. "I'm sorry," Jared muttered, his voice barely audible now, the weight of his words sinking in. "I was out of line." The words hung in the air, heavy and awkward, but Karoline simply nodded. There was no satisfaction in her response, no victory in her tone, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had just transpired. "It's okay," she replied. "People make mistakes. It's what you do next that matters." Jared wanted to crawl under his seat. He wanted to disappear. But the reality was clear, he had underestimated her. He had judged her based on nothing but a fleeting moment of arrogance, and now he was left to face the consequences. As the rest of the flight continued, Jared couldn't help but notice how differently people were now looking at him. Karoline's grace and calm composure had left him exposed, like a child caught in the act. He had no idea just how much he had misjudged her. But he knew one thing for certain, this would be a lesson he would never forget. As the flight continued, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had once been a quiet, almost carefree environment now felt suffocating. Jared could feel eyes on him, and each glance seemed to dig deeper into his self-consciousness. The high-end meal he had been enjoying earlier no longer tasted as sweet. The champagne, which had been a symbol of indulgence, now seemed like a cruel reminder of his arrogance. Karoline, on the other hand, appeared unfazed. She wasn't rubbing her status in anyone's face. She wasn't basking in the sudden attention, she simply returned to her meal and began reading something on her tablet. Her demeanor was calm, unbothered, like a politician who had dealt with much worse than a petty insult from a man who clearly hadn't done his research. Jared tried to focus on something else, anything else. But his mind kept drifting back to her. What had he really done? He hadn't just mocked her, he had insulted someone who, despite her youth, held power. A power that Jared had foolishly underestimated. The more he thought about it, the more his stomach turned. As the plane descended toward its destination, the captain's voice echoed overhead, announcing their approach. It was the final push before they would all disembark, but for Jared, it was as though the descent mirrored the fall of his own pride. He sat there, staring out the window, the scene below blurring into an indistinct mess. The sudden ping of an incoming message on his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. He quickly grabbed the device, hoping for something to take his mind off the moment. But as soon as he unlocked the screen, his heart sank. There, at the top of his notifications, was an email headline that read, "Karoline Leavitt comments on public encounters, how one man's attitude made a mark." Jared's pulse quickened. He opened the email, barely able to breathe as his fingers fumbled with the screen. The message was short, but it hit him like a brick. "Earlier today, I encountered a passenger who questioned my place in first class. Rather than reacting with anger or judgment, I chose to educate him with grace. This exchange serves as a reminder that public figures, especially women in politics, are often dismissed based on their appearances. It is important for us to be mindful of our assumptions, no matter how confident we feel." The email was signed simply, Karoline Leavitt. Jared's hands trembled as he reread the words. She hadn't just let it go, she had turned his moment of mockery into a public lesson. There was no question that her comment would spread. She was already a name in politics, and this exchange, however small, would be another piece of the puzzle of her rising profile. It didn't take long before Jared realized the full extent of what had just happened. He hadn't just offended her in private, he had made a mistake that was now out there, for anyone who followed Karoline's work to see. Her email wasn't just a reflection of grace, it was a calculated move to expose the prejudices that still ran rampant in society. And Jared, without even knowing it, had become part of that narrative. He could already imagine the headlines, "Arrogant traveler mocked by rising political star in first-class incident." His name, attached to a story about his assumptions and biases, would become just another cautionary tale for people who thought they could get away with belittling others. The sinking feeling in his stomach deepened. This wasn't just a lesson about humility. It was a stark reminder of the power of the people we encounter, especially those we underestimate. He'd never thought twice about Karoline's identity, but now he couldn't shake the thought that his life was about to change because of his own arrogance. And it was all thanks to the woman sitting across from him, who had handled the entire situation with the quiet grace of someone who had already won. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the hum of the wheels hitting the tarmac bringing Jared back to reality. He had barely noticed the descent, his mind still consumed by the email from Karoline. It was all happening too fast. The cabin was already buzzing with the usual chaos of people grabbing their belongings and preparing to disembark, but to Jared, it felt like he was in slow motion. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as the announcement for disembarkation echoed over the speaker. As he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his eyes subconsciously drifted toward Karoline. She was already gathering her things, seemingly unaffected by the whirlwind she had just unleashed. Her composure, the way she moved through the cabin with an air of quiet confidence, only served to remind him of just how small he now felt in comparison. For a moment, Jared considered walking up to her, apologizing once again, maybe even asking if he could do anything to smooth things over. But something inside him, maybe pride, or maybe sheer embarrassment, kept him rooted in place. He wasn't ready to face her again. Not like this. As the passengers began to file out of the plane, Jared tried to ignore the stares, the quiet murmurs. He could feel them judging him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet their eyes. Every glance felt like an accusation. He shuffled through the aisle, his legs feeling heavy as though he were carrying the weight of his own regret. By the time he made it to the airport terminal, the real world was starting to intrude once again. But even then, Jared couldn't escape the thoughts that clouded his mind. He grabbed his phone, checking social media reflexively, hoping for some distraction. That's when he saw it. A tweet from Karoline Leavitt. Grateful to be on a flight where I could teach a lesson in humility. Sometimes, all it takes is a kind word to change a person's perspective. #lessons in grace #public service. It was subtle. No mention of names, no direct reference to Jared, just a carefully crafted message that could only be aimed in one direction. But it was enough. His stomach twisted as he realized the tweet would likely go viral. The hashtag alone, #lessons in grace, would turn into a rallying cry for those who admired her composure and strength. Jared quickly scrolled through the comments below the tweet, feeling his face flush as he read the reactions. Love how she handles this. Real class act 100 points. Imagine being the guy who thought he could mock her. Embarrassing. Face with tears of joy. Can we get more people like Karoline in politics? She's a breath of fresh air. The weight of each comment felt like another brick in his growing sense of humiliation. He had thought the day would pass like any other flight, a momentary slip that would be forgotten by the time they landed. But now it seemed that his interaction with Karoline would be remembered far longer than he ever expected. Jared glanced around the terminal, half expecting to see someone pointing at him or whispering his name. It wasn't paranoia, it was the sinking realization that he was now a part of a public spectacle he had never signed up for. He wasn't just the man who had been caught mocking a politician in first class, he was the example of everything that was wrong with society's tendency to judge based on appearances and assumptions. He had been outed. As he trudged toward baggage claim, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from a close friend. Bro, did you see the news? Karoline Leavitt just dropped a bombshell about some guy on her flight. They say it was you. Jared's fingers trembled as he typed out a quick response. Don't say anything about it. It's complicated. But as the words left his fingertips, he knew there was no going back. Karoline had shown him the consequences of his arrogance, not through anger, but through grace. She hadn't needed to escalate the situation, her quiet strength had done all the work for her. And as much as Jared wished he could just forget the whole encounter, he knew one thing for certain, he would never look at people the same way again. That lesson, the one he had been so blind to before, had cut through his arrogance like a knife, leaving him to wonder how many other people had suffered the same judgment he had so carelessly thrown at Karoline. The worst part, though, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following the flight were a blur for Jared. What he had initially thought would be a fleeting, embarrassing moment in time quickly spiraled into a public ordeal. Karoline's tweet had gone viral, and with it, Jared's name was now tied to an image he hadn't anticipated. His friends and colleagues reached out, some with amusement, others with concern. The whispers followed him everywhere he went, both online and in person. At work, he tried to keep a low profile, but the situation was too far out of his control. His inbox was flooded with messages from people who had seen the viral post. Some had found it funny, others harshly critical. One message stood out among the rest. It was a direct message on LinkedIn, from someone he knew professionally, but not well. Jared, I saw the viral tweet about your encounter with Karoline Leavitt. It's making rounds on political news sites. Just wanted to say, you might want to be a bit more careful with your public image moving forward. It could affect your career if this gets out of hand. The message was a polite warning, but it hit him like a ton of bricks. His career, something he had spent years building, could very well be jeopardized because of a single, thoughtless encounter. He had assumed he was above reproach, that his status would protect him from the consequences of his actions. Now, it seemed like every news outlet, from the smallest blogs to larger media sites, was picking up the story, weaving it into a larger narrative about elitism, prejudice, and the need for change in political discourse. As he sat at his desk, scrolling through the endless media coverage, he found it impossible to escape the glaring headlines. Each article added more fuel to the fire. First-class encounter exposes hypocrisy of elite traveler politician Karoline Leavitt shows grace in the face of arrogance mocking the wrong person. What Jared's misstep tells us about politics and class, but the most humiliating of all was the local news coverage, which had picked up on the fact that Jared had been photographed leaving the airport with his head down, clearly trying to avoid the press. The shot was grainy but effective, capturing him in a moment of defeat. It was as if his very posture screamed guilt. The footage was now part of a montage in a segment about the dangers of underestimating people in power. Jared's phone rang constantly, but he had become conditioned to ignore the calls. He didn't want to face anyone, especially after the way they were now reacting to him. His own colleagues at work were speaking to him with thinly veiled pity, while others had taken to social media to share their 2 cents. His once carefully curated image was now shattered. The worst part of it all, though, was how Karoline's grace continued to shine through, even as the media kept pushing her story. She had become a symbol of poise and strength, even in the face of mockery. In her interviews, she was asked about the incident, and every time, she responded with humility. She didn't gloat or seek revenge. She simply stated that the situation was a reminder for everyone, not just men like Jared, but society as a whole, to reconsider how we judge others based on appearance and assumptions. Jared could feel the sting every time he saw her name in the news. It wasn't just about his reputation, it was about the bigger picture that Karoline had painted for the world. She had turned his mistake into a conversation about broader societal issues, forcing people to examine their biases. And as much as he hated to admit it, she had done so with far more grace and intelligence than he had ever expected from someone he had once so easily dismissed. After a particularly brutal day at work, Jared found himself sitting alone in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He stared at the TV, the sound muted, but the constant feed of headlines flashing across the screen reminded him of his failure. The realization hit him in waves. It wasn't just his pride that had been damaged, it was his ability to understand and empathize with people. He had treated Karoline like an outsider, an imposter in a space she had every right to be in. But the truth was, she wasn't the one who didn't belong. The feeling of regret gnawed at him, and as he sat in silence, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever be able to fully redeem himself. He didn't think anyone would forget the encounter easily. And in truth, he wasn't sure he should be forgiven so quickly. Karoline had been the one to take the high road, but Jared had no idea where his own path would lead. The only thing he was certain of now was that he would never look at power, privilege, or the people around him the same way again. The encounter in first class had stripped him of his illusions, leaving him with nothing but the raw reality of his own hubris. And for the first time in a long time, Jared wasn't sure who he was supposed to be anymore. Weeks passed, and Jared's life slowly began to regain some semblance of normalcy, though it was a new normal. He had retreated into his shell, avoiding public appearances and making only the most necessary interactions at work. The media frenzy had died down somewhat, but Karoline Leavitt's name still lingered in the air like a shadow, and with it, the humbling memory of his own mistake. He wasn't sure how long it would take for people to forget the viral story or if they ever would. It was on a particularly quiet Friday afternoon that Jared received a message from an unfamiliar number. At first, he hesitated. But then, as if compelled by some force he couldn't resist, he opened it. "Jared, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the apology. I think it takes a lot of courage to admit when we're wrong. I truly hope that, moving forward, we can all be more mindful of how we treat others, no matter their background or position." It was signed simply, Karoline Leavitt. Jared sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. He had expected many things, more public criticism, perhaps even a personal attack for his earlier behavior. But this message, this small act of grace, stunned him. She had acknowledged his apology, not with the kind of bitterness he might have expected, but with the same level of composure and kindness that had made her such a powerful figure in the first place. There was no gloating, no attempt to rub his mistake in his face. Just a simple, genuine message of understanding. He took a deep breath and set the phone down, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a small spark of clarity. Maybe he couldn't undo what had happened. Maybe the damage to his reputation was irreversible. But there was something he could do now. He could learn. He could grow from this. The lesson Karoline had inadvertently taught him wasn't about power or public figures. It was about people, about how our assumptions and biases can cloud our judgment and destroy others. It was about the humility it took to admit when we're wrong and the strength it took to own up to those mistakes. He had mocked her, judged her without a second thought, and now he was learning what true strength looked like, not in power, but in grace and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Jared worked hard to change his perspective. He started by actively listening to the people around him, especially those he might have once dismissed. He made efforts to undo some of the damage he had caused at work by taking accountability for his actions, apologizing where necessary, and making sure his behavior was more respectful and aware. Slowly, people began to see that he was trying to make things right. One evening, months after the first-class encounter, Jared found himself watching an interview with Karoline Leavitt on a political talk show. The host asked her about the viral incident, and she answered with the same grace and dignity she always had. She spoke about the importance of compassion and understanding, of breaking down barriers of elitism and prejudice, and of leading by example. At the end of the interview, the host turned to her with a final question: "You've become a symbol of grace and resilience to many, especially after the incident with the man in first class. What would you say to him now?" Karoline smiled, her eyes thoughtful. "I would say thank you," she replied, "because sometimes the people we least expect to teach us the most valuable lessons are the ones who make the greatest impact. And I hope he continues to learn and grow, just as I continue to do." Jared sat there, his heart heavy with gratitude and humility. She had done it again, she had shown him the true measure of strength. Not in the act of public humiliation, but in the act of kindness, even toward those who didn't deserve it. And though he couldn't undo the past, he knew one thing for certain: he would never make the same mistake again. For the first time in a long while, Jared felt a quiet peace. The lesson had been harsh, but it had been necessary. And with it, he had learned more than he ever could have imagined. The true test, he realized, was not just how we handle power, but how we handle our mistakes. And in that moment, he knew that Karoline Leavitt had won, not just the encounter in first class, but the ability to inspire change, even in the most unlikely of people. Jared closed his eyes, silently vowing to be better. To see beyond appearances, to listen more carefully, and to treat every person with the respect they deserved. Because in the end, it wasn't about status or privilege, it was about character. And that was the most powerful lesson of all.